Welcome to everyone who is sharing with us this last session of the seminar. This has been a very interesting event and I think very helpful for everyone. And so our main job here is going to be to try to bring about the lessons that we have learned and how we foresee the future of statistics and the challenges for statisticians in general, but especially for public officials in charge of producing and disseminating the statistics. We have assembled a very distinguished audience, and I think it's very well focused, especially on the last part of what I just mentioned. First of all, we have Mary Bohman again. She already participated in the seminar. She's the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Economic Analysis of the US. She holds a PhD from the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of California, Davis. By the way, Chile has had a long association with Davis, especially in the area of agricultural economics. I'm pretty sure you know about that. And she also had she earned before a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University. She has spent a long career first in the Department of Agriculture and then in the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Then we have Marc Ducharme, the Director of Statistics of the Statistics Department of the IMF. He also spent, he has a long career also in the Statistics Canada, where he held a number of positions. He holds a PhD in economics and science policy from the University of Sussex in the UK, and both a master's and bachelor degree in economics from the University of Montreal in Canada. Sandra Quijada is our national director of the National Statistical Institute, INE, and she holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's in economics from the University of Chile, my alma mater, by the way. And she has been holding this position of the heads of the National Statistical Institute since 2020. Finally, we have Paul Schreyer, the director of statistics in the OECD. He joined the OECD in 1988, and he has held a number of positions in this directorate. And he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Innsbruck in Austria. So we have a very comprehensive panel with a lot of experience in different fields of public statistics in both key countries and at the same time international organizations. And first, basically, I would like to start with a question about, well, if you could basically share with us your experience with all this, the role of statistics during the pandemic, the new tools that have been developed, and what are the main lessons that we have learned or you have learned from this episode. I think it has a lot of different dimensions, but in this particular field of statistics, I think it has had a very deep implications. So please, if we can start with perhaps with Mary, and then we follow more or less the same order in which I introduced it. Mary?
Oh, yes, thanks very much. And I've appreciated the opportunity to think about this question, which is something that we're talking about at BEA and within the federal statistical system. You know, what are the lessons learned and what do we do next? And I think the key lesson learned is that our value is very high. We have heard compliments, praise. We had a resolution from our advisory committee about our success, and appreciation from policymakers, financial market power users, and the media about the statistical system and BEA's ability to produce high quality, timely statistics during the pandemic. We see people using our long time series, wanting to know when were the last highs or lows compared to the new data. And then as part of the compliments, we hear a lot about the success in being transparent, that we have really high quality documentation that's easily available, and we provide information about our methods and data quality. And I think this is something that's unique to the public sector, the value we put in the transparency and ensuring the public trust in what we put out. And we didn't see that waver at all during the pandemic, which also occurred during political important election with a lot of scrutiny on the economy. So I think that we feel like that was a success, but one important, and it was important that we put out high quality, ongoing core statistics, but it was also our success reflected the new things that we did, including capitalizing on big data. We put out consumer spending data using high frequency daily card transaction data and use that to improve the quality of our core statistics as well. That was a big success. And we've also developed and released regularly tables about how the pandemic recovery programs fit into the national accounts, and worked with colleagues internationally to understand the appropriate ways and share our experiences in doing that to have good complementary data. And I do think that another success that maybe we didn't hear directly so much, but from policymakers, is the value of having these statistics that are internationally comparable and being able to look globally at the effects of the pandemic. Let me just say a few things going forward. And we've had a couple sessions with important policymakers and users about what they want coming out of the pandemic and their priorities for the Economic Statistics Agency. One thing we hear is that anything new should be a complement and not a substitute. People want everything, and they don't want to have anything go away that we've been doing. That's a challenge, funding wise, capacity wise. And I think we can gain some efficiencies, but we'll have to be clear about new products and need for new resources, and have these continuing conversations about priorities. We've heard the value of the high frequency, high detailed big data. I think that over time, the value of high frequency will probably wane as you see a more steady economy and fewer changes. And something that we all have, who started out doing research, is that daily data is noisy, and not all that noise has value in a normal times, but it's definitely had value during the pandemic. The greater geographic detail and sector detail from this data, I think, will persist, and we're getting ready to provide more detail on regional spending that draws on the big data. And I don't see the demand or value of that waning over time. That's been a long-term trend in wanting more disaggregated data that I think has only been reinforced. So we've got a lot of positive feedback about everything we've done, and I haven't had any suggestions about what to drop, but we've gotten a lot of suggestions about what else is needed. And some of this echoes what was said during the following the 2008 and 9 financial crisis, is the need for more statistics to understand what's happening at all levels of income, especially lower income Americans and citizens, as well as better understanding racial inequalities. And that's an area that we'll need to look at going forward. One final word is that partnerships will be needed. I think our international partnerships will remain important, but we'll also have to continue work with private sector companies, academics to partner in order to advance methods for measurement. And then I think especially as in the US with our decentralized statistical system, we'll have to continue our close partnerships with statistical agencies and the Federal Reserve. And we all agree that our close connections have been instrumental in the success that we've had. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Mary. It's been very useful to have this perspective from a chief statistician in such a big country as the US with all the diverse problems. So, and I can very much sympathize with this idea of increasing demands and adding new things, especially because we combine both the side of the user of statistics as a central bank, but at the same time we produce the national account. So it's kind of, we have a mixed role here. With Marc, perhaps you can add your perspective, especially I think it's very important, the global view, and also the lessons for the new standards for statistics. I think that the IMF plays such a big role there. So the floor is yours.
Buenos días, muchas gracias para la invitación a participar a este panel. I was very honored to participate to the first conference of the Bank of Chile in 2015, and I'm very, very pleased to see that this conference has become very important. So congratulations to all of you, and especially to Gloria. So let me try to answer your question. I can only agree with Mary's point. I think the COVID-19 pandemic was a wake-up call for user and statistician. For user, because it brought the statistics, as Mary said, to the forefront. We needed more information, more frequent information, more quality information. And just think of the health sector, where we were struggling for months of trying to figure out what was going on in most countries. And we're still struggling in some countries. You know, the IMF, as you mentioned, Joaquin, has 190 members. And obviously we have big members like the United States, who has a lot of resources and a lot of capacity. But we also have countries that have lower capacity. And it was for all of them a signal to innovate. Member had to change the way they were collecting data. Think of how in most countries with less resources, surveys are still done face to face. You know, so they had to move to a new paradigm where they had to use technology. And this is not new. When we had the health crisis and Ebola in Africa, Senegal had to drop, for instance, the face-to-face survey, and they had to conduct survey by phone. Well, you're going to tell me we have been doing this in developed countries for a long time, but that was a revolution for them, and they kept doing this afterwards. So those change are transformative for statistical organization. So we saw that there was much more web scraping. Scanner data has become more core to some program of statistics. The use of sensor data using the mobile device, switching to web-based survey. This has been a revolution for some countries. Also, what we have seen is that we had to be more agile and more flexible. So we had to introduce in our traditional survey some questions that were more qualitative and that could be changed from period to period, so that we could inform the policymaker about the question they were asking. You know, we also had to be innovative in terms of using artificial intelligence to read text in response rather than having quantitative information. We also saw an increase of use of machine-to-machine transmission. And I was a couple of days ago to the SDMX conference, where that tool has been used, developed for the last 10 years, but its use has been increased just because there is a need to be more responsive. And finally, for us at the IMF, since that was your question, we do at the statistics department a lot of capacity development. And obviously, traditionally, we used to send people in the country delivering courses. We used to send people doing technical assistance, dealing with the Ministry of Finance, the Central Bank, the Statistics Office. Well, this was not possible anymore. So therefore, we had to move to the virtual world, like we're actually having this conference, and we had to introduce webinar, online course. We had to be more focused, and I think one great lesson is that the statistical agency across the world have been able to adapt to the circumstances and to react more quickly. And this has been a criticism of statistical agency across the world, is that we're normally good at explaining the past, but not very good at responding. I think we have demonstrated, as Mary said, good agility and good flexibility and good adaptation to respond to the policy question. And I'll stop here in the interest of time. We'll certainly have a debate on the thematic and the topic, which is certainly something that has also transformed the way we look at things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc. Perhaps, Sandra, could you have been in the forefront of the fight to produce statistics in the regular way, because these are official, so we have to maintain this machine working, and at the same time, with a lot of problems in order to collect the data. And so perhaps you can give us your experience and see what are the new things that might come up as a result of this pandemic.
Thank you, Joaquin. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to share our experience in this great panel. About us, about our institution, the first challenge we faced was maintaining operational continuity, that you say, of our normal statistical production processes. The pandemic forced us to adjust fieldwork protocols, which included the introduction of measures for the protection and care of our staff and informants to minimize their risk of contagion. In the first phase of the pandemic, we had to suspend face-to-face data collection and rapidly transition to teleworking while concentrating on telephone and web-based data collection for our main products. We have continued this mode of collection, combining them with face-to-face collection for data that cannot be accessed remotely. With this mixed strategy, we have maintained part of our statistical program, which has enabled us to continue producing economic, household, and agricultural surveys. One of the most important issues has been the timeliness of information. To maintain statistical production under changing conditions with more limitation, we have taken certain measures. In addition to those that already mentioned, the transition to telephone service, and we adapt our production to priority information needs. The first measures was to develop of dissemination activities. We have had to focus communication on the impact of the pandemic on statistics. For example, leading public talks and publishing technical documents. The second measure was increased provision of georeference data. In 2020, we launched a geostatistical data platform to identify active COVID-19 cases and to provide socio-demographic population data, which is based on the 2017 census information and economic statistics. The third measure was changes in product planning and publication. For example, we rescheduled the structural survey related to earnings and labor cost indices. In addition, the agricultural and forestry census suspended twice, and the population and housing census, which was moved from 2022 to the following year. And the last measure was suspension of operation. Because of health measures and budget cuts, we had to suspend the National Time Use Survey. In that way, our biggest challenges for this year was conducted the 8th National Agriculture and Forestry Census between March and June on the current during the second wave of pandemic, which required the use of personal protective equipment and special work protocols, with a field team deployed through the national territory. This operation implemented both face-to-face and web-based strategies to obtain the estimated level of coverage required. The web-based strategy design was considered only for big firms with different establishments through the national territory, but the sanitary conditions during the field forced us to extend this mode of collection for every producer or informant that wants to respond by self-report. Several operational challenges was communicate with firms, as some of them suspended their activities or transitioned to teleworking, both of which negatively affected their response levels. And to facilitate the response of informants, we had to develop a series of complementary strategies, which went beyond the original design of the survey. These new strategies include the incorporation of new territorial teams to update contact information, the cross-referencing of information with administrative records, the deployment of fieldwork teams, the expansion in contact information management, the dissemination of communication campaigns through the social media, the collection of contact with unions, and the diversification of methods for remotely contacted informants. For price statistic, we reserve the face-to-face mode of collection for establishments whose prices cannot be collected by telephone or through the web. In contrast, price capture from websites, a method used before the pandemic, has significantly increased. In addition, the pandemic has led to an increase in our use of complementary data for administrative records, for example, food prices in the case of supermarket. About the new production techniques, our institution has been making progress in incorporation of automated bulletins and coding, as well as optimized routes for field teams. Without a doubt, this is a significant challenge that the different data producers have had to assume, and the challenge that will require a change in the profile of professional engaged in statistical production. The outbreak of the pandemic has shown that the traditional production of information needs to reduce the burden on informants and to take better advantage of administrative records. To do this, we must standardize concepts and integrate several statistical operations focused on firms. The use of administrative records can reduce the burden on informants by eliminating questions, by creating new information in timely and continuous manner. We believe that the transparency and timeliness of data is fundamental to statistical production and is the main lesson of the pandemic. This pandemic and the need for the timeless information possible have created new challenges in the openness and the accessibility of information. Thus, we must continue improving the availability of data and the interoperability of these platforms.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Keep going, problem. We're going to invite the audience. There are some questions in a survey that it's been taken, so I will ask them to answer these questions, and so we can report and continue the dialogue using the input that we are getting from you. To finish this round, I would like to ask Paul to share his views and experience of the OECD. Also, these are the most advanced countries in the world, and supposedly the one that have are in better shape to confront the challenges of the pandemic, and basically what has been your experience and what are the challenges ahead that you are discussing at the OECD for the future of statistics?
Well, thank you, Joaquin, and thanks for having me on this panel and for this extremely interesting conference. I'll make a few observations about sort of what happened on the crisis, and then a few ideas going forward. What we observed, and this comes at no surprise because it has been said over and over again, including in this conference, was that what we observed, of course, during the crisis was this extremely strong demand for timely and granular data. The reason simply being that things have happened very quickly, and they have affected the different parts of our society and economy in very different ways. So, you know, small firms were affected differently from large firms. Different regions experienced different developments. You have different effects on the various socioeconomic groups. You have differences in how men and women are affected, how different ethnic groups. And so there was this strong hunger for detailed and timely data. Now that's, of course, we know, hard to satisfy simultaneously, but some progress has been made in doing so. What is interesting is that despite this readiness to maybe sometimes give up a little bit of accuracy and move the cursor towards having more timely and granular data, even if it's a little less accurate or precise, there was still also a real demand for trustworthy information. So in some cases, you had actually too much information almost, and people didn't know where to turn for reliable information. And this, I think, reaffirmed a lot of the discussions among the role that national statistical offices and the official statistical system more generally plays in conveying also this trustworthiness of data that is broad with their institutional setting. The second observation that I made during the crisis is that methodologically, and certainly in the areas that I've been following most closely, we suddenly saw a resurging of sort of new or old problems that we hadn't really been looking very closely into. To give you a few examples, suddenly issues around how to construct index number formula for the CPI came up because you had this massive change in expenditure patterns over quarters. And that, of course, had effects depending on how your index numbers are constructed. At the OECD, at the international level, we were suddenly confronted with issues of comparability of data between different countries that hadn't played out before. The most visible example being the comparability of unemployment rates across countries, because you had a large difference in how, say, North America and Europe dealt with temporary layoffs that happened in the economy. In one regions, those were counted as unemployed, in other regions not. And you see this immediately in largely different measured unemployment rates. So there was an immediate need to communicate and to explain the comparability or non-comparability of certain data. Another issue that came back very forcefully was the whole question of how do we go about measuring the volumes of non-market services, in particular health and education, that governments provide. How do we measure those in the national accounts? In particular, how do we go about situations like homeschooling, where suddenly some of the services are provided by parents and some by teachers? do we need some adjustment here? And again, we observed differences in how this was handled between countries, which raised issues about international comparability. So those are, of course, things that make us think, and we need to distinguish what are the short-term effects that are really only due to the crisis and which may go away again as we come into a new normal, and which are the things that really will make us think for the longer term and where we have to invest further to smooth them out. Finally, of course, the crisis has been sort of a crash course in gathering experience with new statistical sources. So everyone came on a steep learning curve by using differential and new sources for nowcasting and dealing with the timeliness and granularity issue. It was not only a valuable experience in finding out what can be done, but probably also a valuable experience in finding out where the problems lie and where things are hard to do, actually. Finally, I think certainly from an international perspective, it was really a great example for how international cooperation is useful in circumstances like this. It is just important to exchange information, how different countries are dealing with the similar situations in their statistical apparatus. And the various international bodies have really tried to react very quickly here and operating as information hubs, as providers of guidance, so that things are dealt with in comparable ways across countries and with a view to exchanging information between them. I don't want to go on too long, but maybe still a few things sort of going forward from the crisis. One is, of course, this whole idea about embracing innovation, as I just said, is something that we need to strategize and implement going forward. Something that is also valid for certainly for the official statistical systems will be to think through, how can they put in place, or how can we put in place some sort of emergency preparedness planning. I mean, this is a crisis. Another one may come down the road, maybe in a different form. And how can we sort of become more resilient in our systems to make sure that the key macroeconomic and microeconomic data can still be delivered in these situations. Something that is also very apparent in this new environment is the necessity to identify and to work on the skills gaps that may have arisen or become apparent dealing with new sources in new situation. Skills gap with our own staff, with the staff in NSOs and elsewhere. So how can we set up the right development path for permanent upskilling of people working in the statistical system? I already mentioned collaboration, which I think is a really important way forward. Again, we've seen collaboration not only in the sense of exchanging views and collaborating in an information hub, but I think a lot more can be done in terms of co-investing in tools, in methods, in resilience going forward. Finally, and I think this is not so related to the pandemic, but has certainly been accelerated through the pandemic, is the whole issue of data infrastructure and data security, which is again an issue of preparedness and resilience that I think we need to work on collectively. And I will stop here, but certainly more to say also by way of areas that will come through in the future.
Thank you very much, Paul. Very, very useful insights, and especially all the issue of security and in fact the resilience of the system to these shocks. We are in our country, we usually have a lot of natural disasters. We always think in terms of them, but when you get a pandemic, it's a completely different story. And so we are beginning to learn about these new risks coming from very different sources into the future. Just one question, and whoever, we have this, one of the things that we have seen in this process has been the development of new sources of data, new technologies, as you mentioned, new ways to do the usual stuff that we have been doing for a while. How do you see the integration of these new sources of data and these new technologies into the mainstream of the production of statistics that has to be accurate? They have to follow protocols, and of course this is a challenge, but it's not just a question of adding new indices or new data or new information, as Mary mentioned, but also we have to, let's say, integrate the new things into the national. If any of you want to take up this question, how do you see this?
Well, I can jump in and start the discussion, because I think this is one of the things we'll be talking about for the next several years. And but I also think it's something that only happens because you make investments, which is why we have to keep talking about it. For BEA and other parts of the US statistical system, we've been working with big data. We had contracts in place. We had infrastructure in place that allowed us to capitalize that and do new things. So I think that and we've done some looking across the statistical system, and there was very little that was done new that hadn't already been in a research project or an innovation in some area of the statistics that was able to be broadened and deployed in new ways. So this question of what worked and what do we need to invest in, I think is critical to be ready for whatever disaster comes forward next. So I think this is really important. And in terms of what we need to do, I think there are some issues of risks that are different. Obtaining data that you don't own is a risk, but we can do that. For the national accounts, you're always bringing in different types of data. I think deploying it in different ways, yes, there's a risk to trust, but transparency has served us well in explaining what data sources we're using, the strengths and weaknesses, and we've felt that it was our responsibility to use new sources and use them in different ways in this time, because our job is to deliver the best economic statistics, not just to follow the same methods we followed for the last, exactly to the detail. So I think transparency was key and will be key going forward as we benefit from these new opportunities.
Maybe I can just add to what Mary said by pointing to two things that are sometimes misunderstood, not in this audience, but when you communicate with the outside world. The first one is that new sources are typically substitutes for the old sources. I think it is much more the case that they are complements. I mean, they are most useful in making things more timely, for nowcasting, bringing in more granularity, rather than suddenly replacing what we've been doing in the past. And the many applications that we see, I think, go much more in that direction than in the former. The second misunderstanding is that new sources are free. Just because they're out there, and in theory you can go up on the internet and download things, that means new statistics are costless. That is, of course, a big misunderstanding. Anyone who has worked in this field will know that even if you abstract from private sources that you sometimes have to pay actually up, just having a quality assurance model dealing with the data that you get sustaining it over time is a lot of work, requires a lot of resources, and as Mary said, is a real investment for the future that we need to bring in, and we need to communicate to those who finance statistics at the end of the day.
Thank you both.
Yes, if I may add, I think the point of Paul is very important. I would say that there's additional element to the issue. The first one is that we have to distinguish about the sources of data and the technique that we have used in the past to collect this information. And I think that, as Mary said, there's a lot of demand, but there's not a lot of education from policymakers what we should drop. Therefore, statistics office have to innovate, and they have to ensure that they streamline their collection process the best they can using various tools. The other point which relates to the innovation aspect of the question is that indeed new sources of data don't come free, and you have to experiment before being able to put them in core production. And this is where collaboration that was mentioned by Paul and Mary is important. And at the international level, I think international institutions have a role to play, especially in this new window that has opened, which is the use of private sector data. So to give you an example, we have created a consortium called Data Development Partnership with the United Nations, the Inter-Development Bank, the World Bank, the OECD, and the IMF. And we have a group of partners, private partners, that are prepared to share their data for specific research project. And I think this is important to experiment so that we can streamline, we can get rid of the real investment costs that you have to deal with when you're dealing with new data source, so that eventually we can have best practice and we can open up to countries to use this kind of data. There's a lot of promise. I'm not sure how it's going to unfold, but I think that's a responsibility that the international organization have taken, and where they have an advantage, a competitive advantage, because they're big and they share the information with best practice, and I think that's really important.
Thank you, Luzma. Sandra?
Yes, thank you, Joaquin. The use of the new sources and technology have proven to be essential statistical production in the light of the pandemic. But we need to see those in the light of complementary with actual production. It's not one way or another way, it's together. Investment in technology, building capacities, cooperation within a statistical system is really important to use new sources. For example, administrative records or big data. For example, we are analyzing the implications of maintaining a mixed mode of collection for some operation, because we was to have only way to collect the data, and now we need to think to mix this mode of collection and have permanently in the time. The key concepts are quality frameworks. Coordination and cooperation in national statistical system is the cooperation in the public services is the key. We need to have a preliminary study of the new data sources and pursuing in complementary way. For example, we faced our sampling frames are based on only geographical areas, but they don't not include contact information for household, which has been an obstacle for the continuity of household surveys using the new mode, the telephone interviews. Meanwhile, contact information for firms frequently change before the economic sampling frame can be updated. Consequently, to increase our access to information, we must strengthen our collaboration with public and private institutions with data that can be geo-referenced, for example, data for firms that provide a basic service to improve our sampling frames. At the same time, we face the challenges of determining strategies for creating unconventional sampling frames based on the other sources of information that might be useful depending on the specific objectives for each survey. I think the lesson for that is we need to think about the whole system. We need to live to think for one institution. We need to cooperate and think in a national system, and not only in the central bank and the National Institute of Statistics.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Just a couple of reflections from our side, in the sense that a couple of things that we have learned. For instance, there is a lot of complementarity between the different sources of data. For instance, from administrative records, we can get a relatively good, strong data for formal employment, which was very important during this episode. But the data for participation rates, which have been critical for the evolution of the labor market, can only come from surveys. And so I think there is a strong complementarity, as Sandra mentioned, in the different sources of data, and it has been very critical to have both of them available. In our case, there are issues of the infrastructure of the system that are very important. In case of Chile, we have a tax identity number that is unique both for business and people. And so it's very easy if you have access to that, and this is included in almost is registered in almost every transaction. That's very useful information, but there are a lot of issues about confidentiality in the data, for instance, for tax purposes. And so we can use this information, but subject to very strong confidentiality requirements. So there is a lot of power in the way in which some institutions that have been built over time and can be used for statistical purposes. But as Sandra mentioned, that requires a lot of cooperation, especially within public institution. Cooperation is subject to the confidentiality and the security in the use of the data that they collect, because it's their mandate, the one that is in danger if things are not taken care adequately. I think we can now see the results of the survey, and perhaps if with that we can continue the conversation. Felipe? Yes. So first, Felipe, can we have an idea of the number of people who are answering these questions? No. Okay. So that was quick.
I don't know if you can listen to me.
Yes.
I haven't. Oh, so we don't. Let me check. There is.
Okay, perfect.
Some sort of problem. So here we have the results of the survey. I'm going to check for the total. So the question was, do you think that the pandemic accelerated the big data use? the most preferred option was yes in most areas, and the second preferred option was yes in some areas with just 25%. I'm going to check. No, we don't have the totals in this file. I'm sorry.
Okay, but do you, the people who have been answering this question are the people who are attending the seminar, right? And
right.
So how many people do we have connected now?
More or less 250.
Okay, from all geographies, perhaps with the exception of Asia, as I presume, because of the
the time difference.
Yes, so that's that's a big thing. So it looks to me that one lesson that comes out that this big data is has been a major has experienced a major acceleration because of this pandemic and the emergency. That's a very important thing. So what's in terms of the future, let's say, before the pandemic, there was a lot of effort into producing data, trying to measure the extent of the digital economy, the different ways to measure well-being beyond the traditional measures of economic well-being or GDP. And of course, the whole new area of environmental issues, not only linked to climate change, but more recently, especially the growing concern about the state of the biodiversity and the nature in general, and the linkage with the economy. So, but now with, if we look, let's say, hopefully after the pandemic, that basically meant that lots of these things have to be postponed, or even though in some of them we are seeing a lot of action also, it's not, has not, they have not been shelved definitely, but of course in terms of the actual data production, the efforts to deal with the pandemic also has absorbed most of the resources. And how do you see the future? Do you see basically going into the same, in terms of the new issues that are going to be, we're going to be focusing the effort on statistical production? Will they remain more or less the same? Do you see new areas? How do you see progress in terms of the focus of new statistics? Louis?
Yes, this is an excellent question. I think, as you know, we have a statistical forum at the IMF, and the last three forums were on digitalization, informal economy, and wealth beyond GDP. And I think those thematics will remain. But what the pandemic has brought at the forefront is first that we had very poor information on health, very poor information on education, incomplete information, as Paul mentioned. And I think that there's going to be certainly a huge demand to do better here. Climate change, I mean, has been on the front page of newspaper since the start of the pandemic, and it's seen with debt as the next crisis. I think here the importance of physical and financial risk are something that we need to explore, the repercussion of those risks on the society and the economy. There's a real sense of emergency that we have to integrate the economic and financial environment, conceptual statistical framework. And we have, and the OECD in particular, has been working on this thematic for a long time, but now it's really at the forefront of the work that needs to be done so that we can have more granularity, more frequency, more timeliness, better coverage, and better comparability, as Mary mentioned and Sandra mentioned before. So I think that is certainly going to be a big thematic for the future. Another thing that comes with really obviously from the pandemic is the consequence in terms of loss of output and loss of wealth. For decades, we had made a lot of progress reducing poverty, and I think collectively, at least at the international level, we were a bit proud of that. But suddenly we went backward, and we had this huge increase of poverty, people going back into deep poverty, and income distribution has exacerbated as well. The wide income distribution has so those two thematic will be really important. They're not new, but I think they're now more at the forefront. We'll need to have more information on household income, consumption, savings, and wealth. And I think the work that has been done in the past will become more important. You know, just think of the effect of the pandemic on also the inequality of gender. Women have been more affected than men in this kind of pandemic. Also, another aspect that was mentioned by my colleagues on the panel is the access to data. Many of us had tried to use different source of data, use private source of data, so that we could have more frequent information using the administrative data that is used by those providers to the benefit of our own statistics. And I think this is some work as part of the infrastructure of statistics that will need to continue. And here I think international organization can help countries reaching that. Finally, I think another really important aspect, and since we're hosted by a central bank, we have to mention the financial innovation, fintech. I mean, this is something that existed before the pandemic, but has been accelerated. The change in the financial service landscape, the big debate about digital money today, is the cryptocurrency, and all the impact of using financial information on the financial system will remain, I think, and probably will play a bigger role in the agenda of statistical agency. I think one thing that we have to be careful of is to ensure that we have proper mechanism to seek what are the real policy questions that we need to answer as statistical agency. I mean, the fact that there's a growing demand, but there's not a reduction of statistical product, it's important for statistical agency and central bank to be able to make the right trade-off, and that's really important. Of all those issues that I mentioned, 4 of them will be part of the new data gap initiative launched by the G20 in the next couple of months. As you know, after the global financial crisis, the G20 had requested the IMF and the FSB and with other international organizations, including the OECD, to launch a data gap initiative. And this is about to be closed. And a lot of those recommendations, there was 20 of them, had been feeding into our data standard, which Chile has adhered as the DS Plus, and that's a real achievement. So now there's a need for launching a new data gap initiative that will cover climate change, that will cover fintech, that will cover income distribution and data sharing. So there's already some mechanism of coordination at the international level that are getting in place, but there's going to be a lot of work to be done on those aspects, and that doesn't eliminate all the other topics that you mentioned on digitalization and welfare state. So I think that the future is good for statisticians in terms of prospect for employment.
Glad to hear. Perhaps, Paul, you can complement the views from a more international perspective.
Well, Louis-Marc has very nicely drawn the picture of a lot of activities that are ongoing and did quite a few of them are undertaken jointly between our organizations. So I'm not going to repeat this, but in general terms, I think broad issues that we saw before, like the digital transformation and its measurement, are not going away. I mean, we still want to know, we still want to make the digital transformation or digitalization visible in our accounts. We want to say, find out what is the role and value of data going forward. Having said that, of course, the digitalization or digital transformation is not a societal goal in itself. It is a means to other ends, and we want to know about it. And obviously, what has come to the fore very strongly in the past, in the recent past, or is, of course, all the environmental issues that that you mentioned, that Marc mentioned as well, climate change being the most visible one. And there's a broader area of things to be done. In particular, I think at the conjunction between environmental and economic statistics. I mean, we do have the SIA now, which is an international measurement framework, but this is where we want to dig deeper and implement quicker, because this is the area that is most interesting for policymakers when they can make this link between environmental, economic, and indeed social effects. I mean, we all know about the debates that are ongoing on the social effects of raising the price of CO2. Policymakers want to know how to contain distribution effects. We need the data to simulate, to draw scenarios where things are happening. Another issue, and Marc alluded briefly to that, is the development of better and internationally harmonized measures of non-financial performance of companies, which is something that is extremely important for the financial world as well, when you see all these funds that are created around environmentally and socially responsible companies. But then again, everyone uses their own definition for what is environmentally socially responsible. And I think there's a lot to be done in this area. And indeed, the official statistical system, I think, has quite a few things on offer in an exchange with the more private or accounting world that deals with companies. And of course, that's something that's extremely useful and important from a central bank perspective as well. Finally, let me say, you mentioned the whole issue of well-being, which has been very prominent over the past years. I think it's still there, and it's just as important as it used to be. Indeed, when we talk about environmental issues, we can perceive those as our capacity to maintain well-being over time. I mean, you know, we want to keep our environment intact. We want to reduce temperature change in the atmosphere. So to be able to carry forward the well-being for future situations. So conceptually, I think it's still there. In terms of the measurement agenda, two things, and again, those were already alluded to. The whole issue of inequalities remains important. Inequalities, not only in terms of income, but in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of access to services, in terms of social engagement, and this whole debate about inequalities of outcomes, but also inequalities of opportunities, and how policymakers can enhance those, is something that is with us. And I observe this here at the OECD as well. This is, you know, something that the policymakers are very much engaged in. Also, health and social care statistics indeed is something that need further development under the impression of the pandemic, where I think a number of lessons can be drawn about what needs to be done, but also who is doing this in the bigger ecosystem of data and data providers. And I'll stop here, because I'm sure my colleagues have a lot more to say on this.
Thank you, Paul. Mary,
Let me add first. agree with everything that's been said. The demands are strong, and the things that we've been working on within our countries and internationally have remained important. And I think that the pandemic has accelerated trends in some areas. For example, digitalization, where we see, work being enabled by digitalization. We see the data that's produced having value, and the work that we're doing internationally on the value of data and how that fits into our statistics seems important as we look at the changing nature of our economies. And I think that points that have been made about how the pandemic affected people differently depending on the size of their business, their gender, their location, the type of job they had, their income or poverty at the beginning of the pandemic are not going to go away. And there's a lot of interest in understanding how policies can affect these things and improve income distribution. And I think that work we're doing on measurement of income for economic statistics is something that we see increasing and not becoming less relevant. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mary. Sandra, I don't know if you have, at least in terms of the areas of development of new data, the projects that you have at INE for the future of new statistics.
Thank you, Joaquin. Yes, me gustaría, I'm sorry, I I agree with all that the panelists said. We have a lot of work in different areas. I think as an institution, we do the statistical, the official statistical. We need to improve our timely for information. That is central, is very important. For example, that Paul said about the health information. We are working now in a new process or new processing of vital statistics to reduce the publication times, because we need around 2 years to publicate the statistical for, I think for this year, the 2019, the publication is in 2021, and so time is impossible. We need timely information. More than using new data or new data, we need to modernize the processing that we use. We need to use new tools, that the machine learning, the big data processes, in order to make our processes more efficiently. In that way that you mentioned, Joaquin, about the statistics about the labor force. We need to understand how our demographic or our society have changed during these years. That is crucial for public policy. In special in labor markets, we need to understand how the concentration of the labor force have changed, as some people have left it during the pandemic for different reasons, for care about the persons, the different kinds of persons. They don't have any good expectative to found a new job. As well, economic perspective for prices, enterprise creation for diet of them would be important too. But after the pandemic, it has been additional highlighted the need for not only the statistical offices, but all the actors in the national statistical system to acquire the technical, methodological, and above all technological capabilities to exploit the use of data. Not only the central bank or not only the National Institute of Statistics. Our system is decentralized, and all of the service need to adopt the new technology at the new form to make the new statistics. And an important issue is the perspective of biodiversity and climate statistics that Paul and Louis said. In the frame, not only for the pandemic, but climate change will also be important for public policy in all ambits, and its impact on the future and the welfare state, as some and other you two said in that way.
Thank you, Sandra. I think what you mentioned about the demographic changes is a very important issue. It's
Yes.
Usually when we think about demographics, we think about long-term trends. Timeliness and opportunity usually is not of the main it's not the main issue behind them, but with the changes that we are seeing now, it's I think it's going to become more and more important, especially when you look at more specific elements like distribution, geographical distribution of the population, composition, all these issues about inequality, just income, gender, or at the end it has to have demographic and geographic expression in order to be useful for policy making. And I think it's a big challenge. One of the challenges that we have in terms of our role as national account data producers here in Chile is to improve the coverage of regional statistics, which is they come late and with a very limited information. One of the things that we are trying now to do is taking advantage of these new sources of data in order to give a better coverage of geographical statistics. I think the regional and so we're beginning to experiment in that direction in order to how to improve the traditional way to produce statistics using some of the new sources of data. Perhaps one last question. We have just 15 minutes, but one of the issues that is a big concern in developing countries is the impact of informality in both in labor market, lots of transaction in goods and services that are not registered for tax purposes and things like that, that might be a problem for statistics in general. And there is this debate about the role of the new sources of data, trying to perhaps as being as a way to circumvent some of these problems. People perhaps they do not register their incomes properly, but they do have transactions in their credit cards that can be used to monitor expenditure, for instance. So there is some complementarity between the new sources of information and try to deal with this issue of informality. But on the other hand, new technologies might be a way to evade these traditional sources of information. What we are seeing about, for instance, using cryptocurrency for if you want to hide your financial transactions. So how do you see that, and how do you see this interact? Do you see ways in which we can let's say, circumvent some of the problems of informality using new data, or is that more a threat to formality in the sense that the new things that are being done are not very well recorded anyway? So it's perhaps this is not a general issue, but I think it's a very important issue, especially in emerging markets and developing countries. I don't know. Perhaps Luis, is the IMF doing something on this area?
Yes, we're thinking about the challenges like you are.
Welcome.
I think you framed it very nicely. It's at the same time an opportunity and it's a risk. I can give you an example of a good opportunity. In some countries, in particular in East Africa, they use M-Pesa, which is a software that allows mobile banking. And in that country, obviously, they don't have branches of bank outside the major cities. So therefore, the economic activities is fueled by mobile banking. And we discovered that we were able, obviously here, the opportunity is that if we can get our hands on the administrative data of those mobile provider, then we can have quite a good estimation of the economic activities, because the example that O is giving to us is the activities start at 4 o'clock in the morning, where normally it's women, they get up for the children, they get up for the chore of the house, and they also get up for ensuring that the input to their kiosks or their little informal store on the corner of the street is well supplied. So all this happens very quickly because of the mobile banking, and these numbers give you a good estimation of the activity. Now the challenge is obviously to convince these provider that they have a social responsibility, and we can statistical agency or central bank can guarantee the confidentiality. The objective is to provide some good information for the national accounts. Now, the risk is the one that you've mentioned of cryptocurrency, and there's huge debate. And I mean, some countries like El Salvador has decided that it would be their currency. It's still not clear where we're going to end on that one, because you're right. It's a mechanism, a technology that allows people to hide more than to reveal. And one of the important assets of a central bank is the trust that people in the country have on its capacity to manage the money and the currency, the monetary policy, and therefore, if that transparency disappears, I think part of the trust also, and as you know, a lot is based on trust. So there's huge risk. Certainly, the challenge for us as a community of statisticians and central bank and national statistics offices is to try to experiment with those new sources of data, especially in emerging market and low-income countries, where the official statistics is lagging, where the informal sector is huge, is very dynamic and very volatile, and policymaker needs to have information on it. Obviously, the traditional tools such as CAT surveys and using mobile device to survey people on the corner of a street is also available. But obviously, there's much more opportunity if we can get our hands on this administrative data that those providers have. And I'll stop here in the interest of time. I'm sure my colleagues have good example to provide on this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, Joaquin. Yes, that you mentioned about the informality is a new issue. Is a problem that we have for a lot of time, but we need to improve the way to we measure it with the new technologies will not solve the problem at all. But that is why the surveys are still important. And we need to complement this with the exploitation, with the administrative records. But an important part of the current challenges that national office is to take advantage of the formal data available that under established quality frameworks and aligned with the international precept allow for optimizing the use of field collection resources for those informal sectors of economic activity with the complementary with administrative record data. But we need to study technically and methodologically, because the administrative records was not created for the statistical analysis. And we frequently forgot about it. However, it is also important to highlight that the pandemic has also required the need to keep the legal frameworks that allow coordination between the different actors and access to administrative data for statistical purposes. And we need to work a lot in the guarantee the confidentiality of the information too.
Thank you, Sandra. Paul, you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe quickly, I do agree that certain new sources of data can be a very valuable tool to enhance statistics in parts of the world where statistical systems are not that advanced. And I can think, and elsewhere actually, I can think of, geospatial data to get to agricultural information. I mean, this is really helpful and in many respects. There are even people who think that if you look at the intensity of light from space, you can get some sort of proxy to economic activity. That is certainly the case, but I would definitely not go as far as saying, well, we should rely on these sources to now make our GDP estimates on the basis of the intensity of light observed from space. I still think that there is little way around the fact that statistical infrastructure and systems, especially in low and middle income countries, needs persistent strengthening. And I mean, that is the first step, and it remains. There's no sort of shortcut to doing that. The new sources can help, but they certainly are not a substitute for that. I agree also with what Sandra said in particular concerning administrative data. I think those need to be mobilized much more strongly around the world, but in particular in some of the lower middle income countries, including through alleviating legal and institutional barriers to using them. But at the end of the day, informality, if you want to measure it, you need some basic national accounts capacity. You need someone who puts together a supply and use table and then scratches her or his head how to fill in the missing cell for private consumption in a particular area or production elsewhere, using all sorts of sources, because anyway, that's what everyone does, including in OECD countries. But you need a basic capacity and infrastructure to do so. And I think we have a responsibility to work in that direction and to continue doing so.
Thank you, Paul. We have several questions from the audience, but we are almost at the limit of our time. So perhaps this is gonna, since Mary has been quiet for a while, I'm gonna direct just one last question to her. It's there is this trade-off between timeliness and quality of the information, and there is this concern that with faster and more frequent indicators coming from this micro data might make official economic statistics like the one produced by INE or the central bank in the national accounts, for instance, will become less relevant for economic decisions in general. What's your take on this?
I am not afraid of our relevance. I think that it's reinforced by the interest in having a broad suite of statistics, and that we do need to be more timely. In the US, the principal economic indicators are expected to be released 30 days after the end of the activity. So we have long-standing advance estimate of GDP that comes out 1 month after the period, the quarter ends. It doesn't have every data cell. I think Paul put it nicely. We have good methods that are transparent, that are documented, that we track over time for their reliability. And then we put out a second and a third estimate, and then do annual updates as we get more sources of information. And the new techniques have definitely helped us improve the advance or early estimates. Also working with our data providers. BEA did not have had large revisions in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and a lot of it was a lack of source data. That was, the conclusion of looking back at the experience. And we worked with the Census Bureau, one of our major data providers, to identify what's most critical and what can we get earlier. And that's made a huge difference. We've had quite small revisions during the pandemic. It's really surprised all of us how well our source data is held up and our methods. And we've also been able to advance our industry and our GDP by state or regional statistics by up to 30 days during the pandemic. We had a coincident release on almost this week last year for the first time of the quarterly GDP for the second quarter by state, industry, and for the nation. And it couldn't have been more valuable. People want to know not just the top line number that maybe you could get by light refraction, but which industries, which regions, which households have been mentioned. So these are big investments that require things that we're uniquely positioned to produce. So I'm definitely not afraid. I think the interest in what we do is all for the good.
Thank you very much, Mary. Well, thank you very much to all of you. I think this has been a very interesting discussion and a great way to conclude this seminar.